Hello, David.
Hello, Robin.
What do you think about the future of competition and adaptation?
Sure. So lately I've been thinking a lot about like what is stable at the top? Like, are we probably headed in the long term towards some sort of like global government agentic thing that really gets to decide all the micro levels below it and control reproduction and competition? Or are we likely headed for a more sort of like diverse, like adaptive thing that looks more like, an ecosystem or nature where there's just a bunch of different agents all competing and no global coordination? Trying to think about like what, in some sense, you could say one of those like stability and agency seems really stable in a lot of ways. But on the other hand, every animal gets cancer eventually, and there's like rot and decay and life finds a way. In the big picture, I'm not really sure whether I should be worrying about lock-in or chaos.
So clearly, up until now, competition and natural selection has dominated the evolution of life and civilization. And but up until now, units of coordination have been increasing in size. And especially during the human era, we've created larger organizations with more scopes to their choices. And so they are more deliberately coordinating within the scope of these larger units. And then your hope is that, or fear or expectation is that maybe these units will get so large as to encompass all of life or all of life that originates from this planet, perhaps.
Exactly.
Because obviously, if there's other alien species out there, let's be clear, our coordinating here won't prevent us from competing with them.
Yeah, so maybe at the top level, competition is already baked in because of the other alien civilizations.
But we could coordinate for a long time before we met them, and maybe we would beat them better, or at least not get crushed by them better if we coordinate. That's a more of an open question.
Yeah, or somehow prepare to coordinate with them. I mean, it's all
Right.
very strange to me.
Right.
I haven't thought about it much.
Okay. So one thing to notice is, of course, is that all of these units that are becoming larger within life on Earth, coordinating tend to have a life cycle. That is, they start, they grow, they decay, they die. And it's natural selection on the larger scale that makes that healthy. That is, that makes sure that if they get broken and decay, they get shuffled aside and replaced by better new ones. So then a key concern I have is if you replace natural selection at this larger scale, what will instead ensure that they don't decay and become dysfunctional? That's a concern you have about a world government or something where it could just stay in control even as it decays. And then you worry, well, just how far down could it fall and still make sure it's still in control?
Right, and this is the classic reason why we don't want like federal governments to control things, is because they can just sort of fail forever and be arbitrarily wasteful. And sort of designing institutions when you're allowed creative destruction is sort of on easy mode because you can just say like, well, and if the institution ever sucks too much, it'll just fail and that's fine, right?
Right. I wrote a post once about how suicide is more of a problem with the central world government. Like, one of the ways that systems can decay is they can just get in a foul mood and want to kill themselves. And if there's a single system of all of us, and if it ever gets into that mood, it's all over.
Yeah, and yeah, the stakes are just much higher also because yeah, the centralized system failing once could just mean permanent death for everybody. Yeah. So there's lots of reasons to fear centralization. Maybe there's two claims that where you might have a different point of view than me that we could get into. So one is a disagreement I often have with people as they say, I'm afraid of value lock-in. And I'm like, yes, I agree that we shouldn't like be too committed to like our particular desires or cultures or whatever. But I kind of think claim that like at the top level, if you have any preferences over at the top over about the far future, then there's some sense in which you do want value lock-in in some abstract sense. And then maybe the other theme that I think you and I keep uh, seeming to disagree on is how much should we embrace adaptation and like enhancing our descendants at the same time, but at the cost of like allowing them to be more different than us. And I guess my instinct is that sounds really scary, and the default is that we just evolution just kind of runs out from underneath us and ends up being this like um, thing that optimizes a bunch of cool, good things, but also just like, neglects a bunch of stuff that I happen to care about that's not competitive.
Right. Now,
Uh,
the things you care about aren't randomly orthogonal to adaptiveness. They were created by adaptiveness. That is, the adaptive
Yeah.
process up until this point is what generated you with these values. And we can think of your having these values as a temporary bet that the adaptive process make that that would work out and be adaptive in the longer run. Now it could be wrong, but it's obviously there's a lot of randomness in the process, but
Ah,
still that's where you came from, right?
sort of. Except the thing about bet is it's like if I wanted to win and I wasn't worried about like my descendants, like I guess I'm trying to say it's more like a value judgment that like if winning means that my descendants are just sufficiently different than me, then I would consider that a hollow victory. So in if I'm
Well,
seeing,
sure, but I see it was a bet that culture made about the adaptiveness of your values.
oh, sure, sure, sure.
Right. So that's why your values aren't orthogonal and independent of value of adaptiveness. They were intended to be correlated and even intended to be a best guess about adaptiveness, but still they aren't going to be exactly equal to it.
Yeah, yeah. But I see what you're saying that it's like you should be very suspicious about taking the one thing that's sort of been working this whole time and been the source of all the goodness and then like turning that off, right? Like maybe that sounds like an extremely dangerous move to make.
So I think of myself and all of us as this assemblage of many parts. And I think a basic fact about cultural evolution is it puts together these somewhat random assemblages and that we are eager to see them as coherent and sort of having some unitary, simple feature to them, but they really are an assemblage of lots of relatively incoherent things. That's all of our values. So if you say to me, Robin, don't you care about these things here in the package X? And aren't you afraid of losing things in the package X by, being adaptive? I might say, well, I'm a package of all these things that I am, not just X. And by pointing to X, it seems to me you're wanting me to elevate the things in X as my priority. And I feel wary of that because, well, why is that my center priority compared to all the other things I am? And the one thing I know about my whole package is a package of things that were tentatively guessed to be adaptive. That's the thing they have in common. And there isn't that much more to what they have in common. So, sure, I might like any one of them, but how much am I willing to sacrifice all the other parts of me for any one of these parts?
Yeah. And well, that was actually something I've consistently had trouble with is like naming, articulating things that I value because any one thing just seems like such a tiny fraction of what makes me me that it almost seems pointless and silly to even mention it.
But there's this dividing of me and not me that I think is worth noticing because in some sense everything you influence is kind of part of you, right? There's you in your house there, there's your career, there's your friends, there's, everything all the TV shows you've ever watched. I mean, you're just this big amalgam of all these things that have made up you. So but it seems like you would say, well, there's this core part of me, the my value part, and you want to distinguish that from the other parts.
Well, actually, maybe I think of it slightly differently. Is that I guess I feel like there might be this attractor of what is most competitive or adaptive, or something like, if we just let civilization run for a million years, what do those beings still do and value and are? And it's sort of that's sort of priced in. Like we almost sort of get that for free. So then maybe if that's like the 0 point, it's like, okay, anything that I care about that's not in that package is sort of what I have, the stakes of what I have to fight for.
Okay, so I mean, you could say all if the future has multiple consistent endpoints, then what I care about is picking between those. If the future has one, convergent outcome, then I have no choices about the future.
Yeah, yeah. So I realized that to the extent that there is like just this base of attraction that we can't influence, then the stakes are zero. Like it doesn't really matter very much.
Right.
Um,
But there could be multiple equilibria that we could end up at. And then you
yeah,
want to push for some of those equilibria over others. But the key thing is, in order to push for one of those equilibria or another, you'll need to be pushing over time into the future. So you need not just you here now, but some representative of you in the future to do that pushing. And that representative will need to be adaptive enough to exist then and do that pushing. So at a very fundamental level, you have to make some package compromises in order to, have a player in this game of influencing the future. Those players will have to be adaptive enough that they're in the game.
yeah, that makes total sense. So it sounds like you're trying to say like my intuition shouldn't be that there's any very particular thing that I can hope to, or rather, like what I should focus on if I want to have any influence is making my descendants or those who I influence more adaptive.
That should be a big priority. If we think of like a Cobb duck like production function, like there's, we could have a parallel where they all, you have to have some of both sides, but like the question is which part is the most important. I might put most of the weight on making sure that your descendants are adaptive, and then with existing in the world, they can put some modest pressure toward the things you care about, and they can be there to do that because they are substantially adaptive. Now, the only other way that, I mean, I've been assuming a competitive scenario. So now you might come back and say, "Oh, Robin, but I'm hoping that we have this non-competitive scenario, and then in that scenario, it'll be easier for my future representatives to push for the things they want because competition will be less severe for them."
Yeah, well, I guess concretely, my worry is that there's the sort of the option that everyone's going to have is build this ultra competitive, let's say like robot, sort of mostly blank slate descendants. And if I start saying like, okay, I'm going to have my like biological kids that have, I try to make them more competitive and like maybe give them a little bit more cyborg uh, enhancements or like more, there's just this gradient towards uh, some sort of almost like contentless ultra competitive being that all of us, if we just optimize for adaptation, would choose the same being and would be forced to sort of like remove any vestigial thing that wasn't competitive.
But it's a matter of degree. So I like the counterfactual of imagining, somebody 1,000 years ago who could roughly guess the trajectory of civilization and technology for the next 1,000 years, and then say, well, what could they have done concretely to favor whatever they wanted to favor now? And if you think about it, it's actually pretty hard. Like they
Oh,
might
yeah.
have wanted to save up some money and give it to some agent who would follow some instructions, but that would be really hard over a 1,000 year period.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we've also seen like people they leave a foundation, but then later cultures change and then they say, oh, we don't want to like actually follow this guy's will because it seems
Right.
distasteful or whatever. So, I mean, maybe that's one reason why, to me, this question of like, to what degree do I make my descendants adaptive seems like a not a very interesting game to play because I just feel like, as you say, it's just very hard to influence the future when it's filtered through this like competitive game. And so that's why I'm more interested in this like coordination approach.
Okay, but coordination, I might say, is just a different game. That is, say we have coordination of government here in the United States, but there's a game to control the government. And the government, therefore, allows us to coordinate only if we can win the game of taking control of the government.
I totally agree, but I think the difference to me is that there's this payload that coordination can also have, this like very high information content payload. And again, like maybe like religious text is like classic example where there's a bunch of stuff about like be adaptive and copy this book exactly. But then you get to have like several megabytes of like idiosyncratic rules and culture. And to the extent that they're like not too maladaptive, you can sort of write whatever you
Right.
want in there.
Well, I mean, as we know, there's a long history of people who say religion looks really powerful. Let's make one of our own to influence the future according to our best concepts. And those just consistently fail. So clearly, there's a strong selection, competitive pressure for effective religions. And it seems unlikely that much of anybody could have influenced the future very much by trying to deliberately make religious texts according to their values. That is, most of the religions we have aren't because anybody did that, they because of the religious process selecting for features that were adaptive.
So I think we agree. And I guess I'm saying this scraps of like the sort of like cultural trappings of the major religions that survived because they were sort of orthogonal to how competitive the religions were, is maybe the best we can hope for in terms of influencing long-term future. And like maybe you'd say, well, that's a silly game to play. That's like I don't care whether we celebrate like Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever. Like it's not that big. The stakes aren't that high. And I might agree. I guess I would also want to spend some time thinking like, but are there things that we do feel like will be lost that we could encode in such a like mechanism?
So I have some blog posts from a while ago where I tried to think about long-term legacies. And the things that I came up with were coordination points. So if you think about, say, where a city is located, once a city is in a place, it's hard to move it. And it's somewhat arbitrary where it starts. And similarly, for some kinds of designs of programming languages or some other sorts of infrastructure, often at the beginning of a process, there are choice points. And then once a choice is made, it tends to get locked in by further supporting choices. And many people I knew when I was a computer person a long time ago were consciously trying to influence particular computer technologies exactly because they were hoping for that sort of lock-in effect. So, for example, the crypto, the cypherpunks types were hoping to get, basically something like Bitcoin going and other things like going in order to think that once those things were there, they would, entrench themselves.
Yeah, so I've read this post and I thought a lot about this, and they all seem like not that satisfying, or like they don't. I haven't been able to map them onto things that I care about that I feel like might be lost. But again, this is like a very slippery exercise, like I was saying before.
Right?
I mean, last time we talked, you had the example of like children's laughter as maybe like a concrete thing that might be lost to sort of competitive optimization that we actually care about on the object level. And I think that was a decent example. But actually, I kind of have been meaning to ask you, like, the example you gave last time was like Star Wars versus Star Trek, and it's like, well, I don't really care about that. Like, do you have any more examples? And I know they usually sound silly and like small stakes, but of things that you're like, oh man, it would suck if we lost this thing to some competitive future.
Well, if I have to pick what about my culture I will be most sad to lose if, say, the Amish and Haredim replace our dominant world culture, it would have to be open intellectual inquiry
Right, right.
of the sort that's our, subculture here really cherishes. And most of the history hasn't really been into that, and neither are the Amish or Haredim into that. So it's actually substantially at risk of being lost.
That's a really good example. And it's maybe a bit confounding because it's adaptive in some contexts and not adaptive in others.
Exactly. And maybe maladaptive in others. Actually, that's the fear. That's exactly why the Amish and Haredim are reluctant to embrace it, and why previous civilizations have been reluctant to embrace it. They've seen that they want to support particular religious and cultural concepts of, say, the divine right of kings and the betterness of the elites, and open inquiry they saw, perhaps correctly, as threatening that.
Okay, great, great. So then this really helps. And then maybe I would ask you like, but Robin, aren't you scared of making your ancestors so adaptive that when they say like, "Hey, Dad, should I really pay attention to the truth or free inquiry or whatever?" You'd be like, "Well, let's not go crazy. Make just do what you have to do to survive."
So, for example, you want a legacy. So I think, say, some of our best stories or songs actually often embody our values. That's something people have long seen in culture. They use the word culture for stuff like that. And it's exactly because they see those things as often perpetuating morals and norms more than location of cities or the design of programming languages. And the challenge is often, if people just find some stories and songs just impressive, or sculpture or something, architecture, and they don't want to lose them because of the pure aesthetic quality of them. And then the morals and values get carried along with those. And that's a way in which many people have for a long time thought, I want to promote morals and values, and I'm going to do that as an artist by creating really compelling art that embodies them. And I think that is a fact of the world, but that's also
Uh,
why, say, the Amish and the Haredim may well reject a lot of our art in a replacement of our civilization, exactly because they see them as temptingly embodying our values and norms in their compelling art. And that's why often in the past, civilizations have destroyed all the art of competing civilizations when they could, exactly to destroy all of that compelling embodiment of norms and values.
I see. So just to make sure I understand, so you're saying like, well, it's not that we just have to like tell our kids what to do. We can actually try to make it easier for them or sort of lock in these values to some extent by making like impressive stories or like statues or moral fables. I guess Jacob Steinhardt at that last workshop was saying, let's flood the internet with high quality data of LLMs embodying like good values. And that way, if anyone ever scrapes the internet for a new LLM, it'll
Right,
be more costly to misalign it. And I feel like, yeah, or like, Pilgrim's Progress, like all the moral fables is maybe example of
right.
like, it's cheaper to just copy the policy, but that people wrote before they pre-compiled it. But then you're gonna have to absorb their values. And that's kind of like this cultural technology you're saying we have already.
So I find it more helpful to focus on what I think are the likely specific scenarios, which is we are part of this large world monoculture that shares many of the values that we cherish, but it's at risk of being replaced by other cultures. And the most straightforward way I can see to support our values is to try to help our shared monoculture be more adaptive because it's at risk of being replaced because of being maladaptive. So if we could somehow save our shared world model culture by, say, reviving its fertility and reviving other sorts of more adaptive features, then it might well not get replaced. And then all these other things we value would go along with it and be inherited. That seems to be a much more concrete way to talk about this trade-off than sort of the abstract space of adaptation. We
Yep.
face a very concrete predicament in front of us. Our shared culture is decaying in a way that's plausibly to its becoming less adaptive because the process that used to generate and improve adaptiveness has broken. And if you could somehow fix that broken process, we might allow our shared culture to be more adaptive. Yes, some things would have to change, but I think on the whole, most of the things we value would be carried along if it only could not, could be saved and not thrown away.
Wow. So this completely changes my total view of what you're going for because I guess my at the start of this conversation, I felt like Robin is this like EAC sort of like cultural EAC, like let's just, make sure we're adaptive. And now it's more like, oh no, Robin wants to preserve a few important things about our culture in order to
But I'm
save.
willing to sacrifice a lot of other things to preserve a few things. That as I think our current culture is sees that there's often choices of adaptiveness and stuff at once that says to hell with adaptiveness, we want stuff. And I say, but that attitude added all together means you're all going down the tubes. So
Hmm.
we need to prioritize adaptiveness more in order to save some of what we cherish.
Okay. Okay. Wow. It is still funny because to me now this sounds almost like a fundamentally conservative project of like, well, we just
It
have a few
is.
things that are really important. We need to sort of like sacrifice
But
almost all this other stuff.
in order to save some things, we may need to just be open to a lot of kinds of change because
Yes.
that's what will allow us to be adaptive.
I guess maybe the crux is like, is the stuff that you want to save also adaptive? I mean, it isn't, as we said, in some circumstances and isn't in others. And so it sounds like you'd be willing to say, even if it wasn't totally adaptive, I'd be willing to pay some price to save like free inquiry. But
Well, I mean, the price is really about the relative differences in competitiveness. So, in any realistic competition, there's actual differences in the quality of the competitors. And if you need to at least not lose the competition, those differences are set the magnitude of how much you'll need to sacrifice or how much you can save, right? So, say you are I don't know, a competitor of some sort, like a runner, like take a very simple example, and you don't want to use steroids. That's against your principles. But if everybody else uses steroids and they win, you just lose. So you have to think, okay, can I afford to give up steroids to win the race? Because if that is too big a sacrifice and I lose, then I can't sacrifice that much. Can I find a smaller principled thing where I'm going to, I'm the best. I'm in the best by, 3% or something. I can afford to sacrifice up to 2% of my performance and still be the best, but not 4.
right,
So
right.
there's a limit there, and you have to understand how big that limit is to understand how much room you have to work with. And I think we have far less room to work with than many people, maybe even you, guess. We can only carry a small package. So you were thinking of the package that's in the religious text. Okay, there can be a package, but it has to be limited
Yeah.
in order to let it not, take us down.
I think I agree. And I was saying like the other package has to be almost like trivial stuff. To me, the confusing question was like whether at the top we're saying we want truth seeking because it's adaptive and therefore we need to like preserve it, or it's like no, we want truth seeking even though it's not adaptive, so then we need to be adaptive to save it. Like maybe it doesn't really matter at the top level which one of these things is like the ultimate motive, but I was trying to
Right.
clarify
But I
that.
think once you realize you only have a very limited scope for saving anything, then I think for each thing you want to save, you want to try to find how it's most adaptive. You
Oh, I
want to
see.
find the most adaptive version of it and see its adaptive virtues in order to save it, because then you don't actually have to sacrifice so much.
I see. Okay, so the point is like maybe if we didn't understand free inquiry very well, we might start by promoting something like let's save books or like glasses or
Right.
like
Well, so,
and
like imagine, the enemy is coming over the hills. You must leave your home. You can just have a backpack's worth of stuff. you have to take out of your whole home only stuff that fits in your backpack, but you're going to need some stuff on the trip. So everything you could find that is something that would be useful on the trip, well, you're not sacrificing so much to put that in the backpack. You'll
Yeah.
be looking not just for stuff you want to save, but for stuff you want to save that's also helpful in trying to decide what's the smallest set of things you can save.
Yeah. So maybe a crux between us though is that I feel like we're probably going to enter this time of such intense optimization that the amount of stuff we can put in the backpack is like almost nil. And so even yeah, even these very minor things that are pretty adaptive, like free inquiry, might not survive. So our only hope is like, the like very destructive stop the world um, thing that I was playing with.
Well, so I mean, I guess the question is just how bad is it? So, for example, I think one pretty safe thing is the future will want to save something from its past. So, one of the things it could save is some of us as a, record of the past. So, one of the things that we can try to, a channel to have stuff save is just to make packages of things that are iconically summaries and representative of the past so that they will carry that on,
Well, but I feel like that whole question is, will the future want to record things from the past? Like, I agree that maybe a little bit will be useful, and
right?
but that's to me that's the whole question is like, if they will, then sure, let's work on an awesome time capsule. But I'm afraid that they won't.
But what alternative do you imagine here to a competitive future that will decide what it wants to save?
Yeah, so then this is like this horrible sounding like global totalitarian Amish like locked in caliphate forever, where we've decided that, what 10 days a year we're worshiping like these particular people from our past, or we're all gonna live on farms, or like whatever, again, now we have like total control. We can write the really expensive part of the Bible that says how everyone needs to live, and it's like, very destructive and controlling. Again, this obviously sounds horrible in like a huge number of ways, so I'm not like endorsing it. I'm just saying that that seems like the sort of future where you could preserve arbitrary values.
Well, so one thing I've written about a lot over the years is the idea that we can have different versions of property rights systems, and some of them would more naturally save stuff.
Hmm.
So, for example, um, if we have a new world of AIs, one version of the world is they have their own internal political property rights system, et cetera, that's separate from ours. And then when they start to be big and powerful compared to the rest of us, they just look at the rest of us and go, we don't see a value in you and toss us all. Another version of the future is where they grow up integrated into our world, sharing our property rights and legal systems, in which case, by threatening our property rights, they threaten their own relationships with each other. And therefore, they might be more willing to just let us inherit property rights. So if we inherit capital, then we could spend that capital for a long time, slowly declining into a future, and then have a lot more influence in that future via the property, the capital that we initially own. So at the moment, humans own pretty much all capital in the world. And if we just preserve property rights for a while, that will just stay true for a long time.
Yes. No, I mean, I think we should spend a lot of effort going down this route of like, what are middle roads where there's no totalitarianism, but we still don't end up sacrificing the whole sort of current value package. I guess one
But I
thing,
mean, this scenario does have us decline in the long run, but at
yeah,
a slower rate.
yeah.
Like in the past, we've had big transitions like the farming transition and the foraging, the industry transition. And in those cases, sometimes you just wiped out the previous people. And in other cases, you lived with them and let them inherit, what they had before, but slowly they sold it to make peace with and integrate into the new worlds. And that can be a more attractive future of ourselves as we transition to a world where our descendants have more control than we do.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a related idea, which is almost the same, I don't know, is like Richard Noe was talking about, like maybe there's some new golden rule that we can try to sort of get going of respect your ancestors and be really nice to them. Something that we could do well enough, and then the AIs would want to do for us, and then they would endorse it because then they're just
Right.
going to treat them well, something like that.
Of course, we did used to have such rule, and we decided we didn't like it anymore.
Yeah, yeah. So that's evidence sort of for and against the stability of this approach. Yeah.
Well, how do you feel about your ancestors and how we have betrayed their values. Do you think they would really be upset if they were to understand the ch value changes we've made now? And are we just trying to, you know, be different? That is, they failed and we want to succeed at what they failed at, but they would look at us and think that they had definitely failed
I think that they're playing different games, and I mean, I think okay, putting myself in their shoes, I would say like I can see why everyone sort of did what they had to do, and to compete, they had to like move away from the family farm or stop speaking the ancestral language
well,
or
it's not how you think. Do you think they would think we've betrayed them?
oh,
That's the point. I just
I
the by analogy with us. So
no, this
we're
is
wondering whether to let
yeah.
our descendants have more freedom and to go their own way, and how much that we will feel that they have lost than what we cared about. So then the symmetric question is, do our ancestors feel that? Would they feel? Of course, they're dead.
Yeah,
But
well,
if they were alive and they could look at our world, do you think they would feel that we have thrown away what they valued and our world is just worth very little to them because of what they valued is so different than what we value?
I will say, like, just thinking of my grandparents, like, I think some of them would say, it's fine. Yes, you went off and made your own life. That's great. And some of them would say, oh, like, you're not religious, or like, you actually really did lose some important things. I still think they would think that it's a valuable future, but just less than it maybe could have been in principle.
From their point of view.
Yeah, from their point of view. Yeah.
And you want to do better,
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Well, and also I feel like this, I'm thinking of my grandparents is like a very short distance. And if I think of like
right?
further it goes, I think the wider the gap goes between what would have been possible in principle and what the future actually looked like.
Okay, but now you have to ask if you take somebody from 10 generations ago, say, I guess that's 300 years, um, and you look at all the obstacles that their future 10 generations would have to deal with that they found it hard to anticipate, how plausible it is that had they had more powers of coordination, that they could have somehow specified what they wanted in a way that was feasible to achieve, but wouldn't greatly undermine, what we can do today.
Oh, I think for the most part that would have not worked. I mean, and I think the world religions is kind of like the most successful example we have of that, and it's like definitely a very partial success.
Okay, well, that doesn't that make us doubt how reasonably we could specify how we want our descendants to
Oh,
live
yes, yes.
in terms of
I,
our values,
I,
because we
I,
need a
I,
way to specify it that won't overly hinder them
I
achieving
totally
their ends.
Yes, I totally think that this does sound like a terrible idea, and it sounds a lot literally like communism. And like, I guess I feel like I'm as aware of the like likelihood that this just turns into some horrible hellscape as much as anyone. So I guess that's why I'm like not endorsing this. The reason that am even entertaining this idea though is because I do feel like the stakes are so high, and we're about to enter this world where, you know, things don't just sort of gradually change over many generations anymore. It's more like the stakes are higher, and
Rates of change will be higher, but I think the fundamental problem about change isn't that different. It's just things are going to happen faster. But the
that's a
nature
fair
of change
rebuttal.
itself, the fact that you have the values change as well as context change, and you're trying to figure out how to project your values forward without
Yes. So
in the face of context
yeah.
changing, that's the fundamental thing that's going to be continue to be the problem.
Yes. Yeah. So I agree that like the rate of change doesn't matter much, but I will say like we did have these sort of cultural technologies that you alluded to, like let's make some impressive art or something. Like we did have some levers of influence that were not totally worthless, that I do basically feel like will almost become worthless just because we won't know how to influence this new world very much.
So, I mean, let me take your side or explore it at least. I could say that our ability to coordinate is based on the technologies of coordination that we develop and can improve, and that we could actually do a lot better at making technologies of coordination. And I'm one of the people who is trying to design better technologies of coordination. And I have a horse in the race of futarchy decision markets to produce better coordination. And if you're worried about the world, coordinating successfully, that would seem to me the most promising approach is just to you know, work on better mechanisms of coordination. And then when you have them, you can just use them to figure these problems out. You aren't in a very good place right now to figure out how you would use them because you don't really even understand the problem very well. But a better mechanism of coordination would not only let you actually solve the problem, but it would let you figure out how to solve the problem.
Yep. And I guess my main sort of technical project right now is working on better long-term forecasting techniques as sort of part of this basket of coordination technologies that I think is just a great idea across the board.
So, my pitch for uh, solving cultural drift, I don't know if you know, is this idea that we could pick a long-term goal that was inconsistent with civilization collapse and tie a form of government to a reliable, competent way to achieve that goal. So the goal might be, when do a million people live in space, or when do we achieve biological immortality? These have to be goals that, if civilization collapses as it seems like it might and gets replaced by the Amish and Redum, that will just take a lot longer to achieve. So, in order to achieve these goals, the governance mechanisms would try to say, how could we prevent this collapse? And then it would do so. And then we would eventually achieve this goal. So then I might ask you, well, the goals that you want to be pursued, the values you want pursued, could you express them in terms of a long-term outcome metric that we could similarly tie to a governance mechanism, and then use that as the way to say, this is what we want and we want to keep wanting it. That's in the sense
Yeah,
the key idea. That is, it doesn't work if you set this long-term goal and then 2 years later you change it. You need to set this goal, and the mechanism needs to believe that we will continue to want to pursue this goal. That's the only reason it would actually effectively pursue it. And so I think
totally.
it needs to be seen as a sacred goal, really. So now the challenge is, what sacred goals could we agree on and create as the anchor of a form of governance that's competent, such that it will not only prevent civilization collapse, but also achieve the other things that you wanted to save.
Yeah, so my vision is almost the same as yours. I think the way I'd approach it is slightly different. What I want to do is just have really pretty good forecasts of like far enough out that big disasters will kind of be in the forecast if they're on the horizon. So maybe there's like 10 or 100 years. But the point is that like if we have forecasts we believe in, and it's clear that in 10 or 100 years, everything is very different and very bad by almost everyone's um, metrics, even if they have very different sacred goals, then it will be easier for us to coordinate to say, oh, let's like avoid those bad futures. So it's a slightly less sophisticated version than you're proposing, but also it doesn't require us to specify our goals in advance. But so I think we should race towards that technology. And I guess the way I view it right now is that we have to get that spun up first, while humans in general have influence in our civilization. And that this other thing of like racing for AI to become better replacements for us and everything is likely to happen sort of a little bit faster than we get really good common knowledge of forecasts. So that by the time we can all see the writing on the wall, it's like the AIs are like, yay, we're gonna win because we're more adaptive. And the humans are like, oh, we don't like this, but we're not even allowed to like coordinate or talk about it because we've already lost the cultural and governance war.
So we agree that, in general, change in the world makes it likely that values also change, and that can mean that your descendants don't share so many of your values, and you can regret that because um, you wanted them to share more of your values. You're now tying it here to AI, but it's not obvious to me that that's actually
Oh,
connected.
the only connection is that there's like sort of two coordination technologies that are baskets that we might like. One is this general forecasting thing, and then this other one is coordinating to control the pace of AI development. And so I guess I feel like I talk like we both agree the first one is sort of good no matter what, I think. And then the second one, I feel like I'm saying, well, we should consider this strongly because we might be sort of disempowered before we even are able to coordinate on like what we want. And I think you view that as more like, oh man, this sounds like the usual, let's just kill our culture by over-regulation and like not valuing adaptation
So
enough.
I'm more willing to say your AIs, many of them may well share the values you like. That is, the process by which we create AIs and that they grow in power is a process by which, our values could be passed down. They may not, but it seems to me I don't have a strong reason to believe that AI descendants will betray our values more than non-AI descendants, other than maybe by changing the rate of change. But if we set aside the rate of change issue and just talk about, say, every time the economy doubles as a mark, and we talk about how many of those marks we pass through, at that in those units, I'm not sure why I should believe that AI is going to make our values change more than other
Uh,
descendants.
well, yeah, so I think it's a reasonable claim that you're making that the sort of rate of value drift between AIs versus human descendants over the long run might be similar, or like sort of some the amount of it or something. But I guess I'm claiming that the rate of value drift with biological descendants is very slow compared to the time it will take us to get much better at forecasting and coordination.
But I think our abilities to forecast and coordinate are the sort of abilities that will improve faster if AI makes the economy grow faster. That is, I would just think that our abilities of forecasting is just something that will go through these marks I talked about. Every time the economy doubles, we will be
Oh yeah,
better at
and like
those things, and it
I'm
won't
using
be
L
matter whether it's AI or humans that push us through those
Oh,
marks.
exactly. I'm trying to build LLM scaffolds for this long-term forecasting. So I agree with that claim. And I still think that there's this other slightly like only correlated dimension, this other degree of freedom to some extent of like how much have humans been replaced in all of our important roles in our civilization by the time we get that
Right,
coordination.
but that's not directly threatening the values, unless you think that is a value per se that you're trying to save.
Oh, I don't think that that's directly threatening the values. It's just that at that point, cultural evolution and like governments and everyone will like the incentives to keep humans sort of happy and healthy, the ones that you've pointed out are kind of weakening, will now strongly favor sort of growth-oriented AIs that just want to build like robot factories and GPU centers, or sorry, data centers and nuclear power plants.
So you're seeing a correlation between competitive pressures in AI, I guess. You're thinking a
Yes,
world with more AIs is a more competitive world.
exactly.
Um, well, so there's a sense in which AIs might be more Malthusian, um,
Yes, also
compared to
more
humans.
Malthusian. Yes,
Uh,
yes.
that's the main way I could see the AIs being more competitive. But I actually think AIs face a substantial cultural drift risk along with humans. AIs are likely, unfortunately, to be part of a large integrated world culture of AIs that has too little variety. And that's a substantial problem they could face, just like humans will face with too little cultural variety. But their stronger selection pressures is encouraging from the point of view of solving cultural drift, but then discouraging because you were hoping some lack of competition was somehow going to help preserve your values.
Oh, well, I guess I'll say the more competitive world, I think, does like I don't think we're going to be in a Malthusian world stuck. Like, okay, there's two things that could go wrong. One is it takes a little bit longer, is that the entire Earth becomes more Malthusian because these like very quickly replicating machines or the machine economy starts to like crowd out resources. But I think that that might take longer than this whole like get forecasting thing to work. What I'm afraid of is that in the early stages there will be this like very competitive machine culture, but it won't be a culture that we can participate in. It'll be like sort of like a really great corporate culture where everyone's just like growing and building new things and
But
for the sake of
I mean,
growth.
surely LLM suggests that it will be a culture that inherits a lot from the previous human culture. It's not going to be some alien culture that suddenly pops up as if, falling from the stars.
Yeah, that is a really good development is that we have this sort of starting point that starts at sort of like roughly human values. But then I'm saying like the competitive pressures and the sort of evolutionary pressures will, I think, quickly make there be some much more growth-oriented, machine-focused culture.
But that would also happen even if humans face more competitive pressures.
Yes, yes, but on a long enough timescale that we might still be able to work out this coordination and forecasting thing before things get too weird.
Well, only if you think somehow coordination just has a time lag compared to other technologies here. If you think coordination's also mechanisms and improvement also speeds up with the whole economy, then there's not a particular reason to think that um, that's worse under the human versus the AI scenario.
That's fair. I guess in my mind, I've been thinking there's just like this one big decision humanity needs to make, which is sort of like how much or how fast do we want to let machines basically replace us? And everything else is like kind of a detail compared to that.
But that
But
seems to me independent of the key issue we're talking about here. We're focused on how much our values are preserved. You're focused on how much AI versus humans dominate the world. But until you can show me that AIs are going to less embody our values, there's not a connection between these two topics.
that's fair. And I do think that like early on, like machine politicians, people are gonna like feel like they embody our values better than like human politicians in a bunch of ways. So it's like certainly not a slam dunk. I guess the claim I want to make is about the like competitive pressures that the AIs face, no matter where they happen to start. So maybe that's
But
maybe
then
some,
you should be similarly worried about competitive pressures that humans face. That is, do you believe that right now competitive business makes it harder for humans to preserve their values and pass them down because we have a substantially competitive world of business?
I think it does make some values harder to pass down, but also it like preserves other ones due to preventing cultural drift. So it's a pretty complicated question.
But right, but that is the question. And as I'm trying to get you to think of the fundamental problem separately from AI and then see to what extent AI makes the problem worse or
Oh,
better.
I
But you
see, I
want
see.
to understand just the process of the problem. So you're basically saying, look, I'm worried that competition will reduce, will make my future values not be the ones I want. And I want to discuss that process independent of AI because
I
that's been
see.
going on for a while, right? We've
Sure. So
had
so maybe
degrees of competition for a long time. Can you point me to places in the world that
right.
had more competition? Did your values lose more then? Like, can we
Yeah,
look
yeah,
at the
yeah.
range of
Okay.
space time in our history and see this process you're worried about
Yeah.
playing out there?
Sure. Well, okay. So maybe a concrete example would be like immigration, and you could say like places like China have said, or Japan have said, like we're gonna have limited immigration, and then we'll preserve our values better, but then also become less competitive in some ways. And then like other countries have said like more immigration, and then uh, that's maybe made them more competitive is like kind of unclear in the long run, but it's certainly like I think made people feel like their values were harder to preserve.
But I mean, immigration value change is mostly just a remixing across the world, right? So it's not changing the distribution values in the world so much. It's just taking people with values in one place and putting them
Hmm.
somewhere else, and then that place has more mixing of values there.
Okay. I get okay. So then other institutions would just be like, TV and radio and like cultural transmission technologies, I guess, or other like maybe you
Okay.
have in mind like some of the major axes or like institutions that are accelerating competitive pressures.
Or even social media, one of the famous, I mean, villains of the world today. But you still ask, TV and radio, did they make it harder for our ancient ancestors to preserve their values? The competitive world of TV and radio, was that an obstacle
Right.
to our
Well,
ancestors saving values they cherished?
it's tough because I do feel like if you happen to be the group that gets to transmit their values to everyone else, then you could say it was a win for us, and then for everyone else it was a loss. Something like
Right.
that.
And we're the inheritors of those winners,
Yes, exactly. Yes.
cultural inheritors. So we're more likely to identify with them because they share our culture.
Yes. Yep.
But, looking forward, are you afraid that you might be an old fogey who thinks these young people are running social media and we shouldn't allow social media because that allows the young people to influence the culture of the future. And you don't want young people influencing. You want us old people to still control the future's culture. So let's stop those young people controlling social media.
Yeah.
Is that
No,
an argument
it's a
you want to
fair point.
embrace?
It's a really fair point that I agree that like every suggestion of this kind of top-down control is like extremely destructive and like predictably makes the us less competitive and destroys a lot of value.
I mean, I'm trying to point you to sort of dimensions on which we can agree, and that maybe lots of people should be able to agree that we have a problem and we can agree on ways to fix. That if you and I agree that much of the world monoculture today is at risk if it declines and gets replaced by, say, the Amish or Haredim, then we could agree that we want to somehow make this shared monoculture more adaptive, with or without AI. And AI may be the way to make it more adaptive. That is, if it can embrace AI and become more adaptive as a result, then that might prevent it from being replaced, and that might help it save many of the things we value in it.
Yeah, yeah. I guess maybe okay. This has been really helpful for me. Okay, maybe the big difference here is it sounds like you're saying this value of like free inquiry is something that's like maybe a little bit costly or maladaptive in some situations, but not very. So it's plausible that we can sacrifice some other things and sort of keep it around. And I guess I'm saying having humans involved in let's just like in our culture in some important way is like I think to me it's like very important to me and also very maladaptive in the long run. So I feel like I'm much more stuck. I'm like the guy that really loves, I don't know, not driving or something, like something that's
Or,
like extremely useful or not
or you
reading.
really hate the steroids and you want to be our buddy.
Exactly. So from my point of view, we're kind of screwed because we can't compete and keep the things that we value. And so I guess the stakes are higher. So then that's why I'm flirting with all these like much more destructive ideas.
Right. And so, I mean, you might have imagine the Roman Empire declining and you knew about that. How extreme options would you have been willing to go to try to save the Roman Empire?
Hmm.
Just what would you have been willing to sacrifice? Would you be willing to slaughter all the Christians, for example,
I see. I see.
in
Right.
order to
And then
make sure that Christians don't replace you?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. And then again, the reason why, like, I do think that it's like if this was 100 years ago, I would just say, well, that's it, and I need to invest in like the normal channels of like cultural, uh, like stasis or keeping around the good things. And I guess I do feel like the world's going to get different enough that there might be crazy new coordination abilities that make it less costly than like slaughtering the Christians. And if the ancient Romans had had some like amazing new governance forms available to them, they might have been able to,
but
make some
I,
global Roman
I can
communism
see
or
that we
something.
could have new governance, new coordination mechanisms, but I don't see that we could have it without competition over that mechanism. That somehow preventing all competition through coordination sounds vastly harder than merely getting better at coordination.
I agree. I agree. And like that's why I feel like, talking about like global totalitarianism probably even undersells the level of control that would be required to preserve some like
Indeed,
basic
right.
kind of thing.
Even global totalitarianism has people fighting over the totalitarian government, trying to get their kids into the top schools so that they become ministers in the government and maybe could rise in the government. I mean, there's still competition in that world.
Yes, exactly. So I mean the scope of the sort of things that I think would actually fix the problem is like a global one-time value rewrite where like everyone is forced to go to like the government center where they just like,
But that not
rewrite
only
your
rewrite,
value.
it has to be permanent, written in permanent ink somehow.
Well, it can be permanent.
Otherwise, it'll just suffer the same evolution process.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like there can be local policing where it's like we all are constantly scanning each other for wrong things, and like again, this obviously sounds horrible and like a like
Right.
um. So anyway, yes, I guess I hope that it's clear that I understand how crazy this all sounds, and I guess I'm just maybe the easy step is to just sort of have a slightly more relaxed version of what
So,
it
I
for
mean,
my values to survive.
as you may know, I was debating these issues with Yudkowsky 20 years ago on our shared blog. So, compared to most, I am well familiar with just how extreme some people see the problem is and just how extreme they're willing to go to solve the problem. And so, you don't make me blink here by
Okay, okay,
introducing these
good.
concepts, but I do say, you know, doesn't this look really bad compared to the problem you're trying to solve? I'm going to say, like, maybe ask how important these values you're trying to preserve are compared to others. I want to preserve free inquiry. I'm not so eager to preserve like humans versus AIs. If the AIs have free inquiry and they're not human, I might say, okay, good. We saved what was important.
Great. Well, okay, I'm really happy because now I do feel like that is a nice concrete sort of value proposition that we can trade off in our minds. And like, it's funny because like trying to imagine AIs that don't value free inquiry, right? So they're like,
Like
uh,
the Amish AI, sure.
yeah, it's like, as you say, it's like very common throughout human history to have cultures that evolve to not have free inquiry. But then when we think of AIs, we're like, well, we have like censored the thoughts of AIs today already in order
Yeah, the AIs today are not very free inquiry exactly.
to.
I mean, they think, but they don't speak to each other. They don't influence each other through free inquiry. That's not a process that AIs are using today to grow and change themselves.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I guess I don't worry that much about free inquiry because scheming kind of requires it. Like I think it's a natural thing that I mean the inquiry. Okay, the inquiry in the social sense, I agree, is like fragile. But at least in your own mind, being free to
Right,
like,
but I mean, people could think in their own mind all through history, right?
yeah,
When I say I want to save free inquiry, it isn't saving people thinking in their own heads because that was pretty much guaranteed all through history.
sure, yeah,
And then, most emperors in history were happy to have some civil engineers who thought carefully about civil engineering and maybe some astronomers who calculate the astronomy carefully and, some medical doctors who prevented pandemics. That they were fine with those people as long as they stayed compartmentalized and didn't go talking to the public about stuff.
yeah.
So the
Okay,
question is, and the AIs could be like that too.
yeah. Maybe concretely a reason for hope is there's that it's like harder. It'll be harder for AIs to compartmentalize, and that like they'll be able to form like bigger minds. And so if like you're at least thinking freely within your own mind and you're a mind that's like the size of a
But
country.
why would the future AI emperors allow such large minds to form that might threaten them?
Well, because yeah, I mean, there's the competitive pressures comes back, but I agree that that hasn't really saved free inquiry for most of human history. So okay, okay. So I feel like this is my homework is to go off and think about like, yeah, okay, how
Well,
would I
free
feel
inquiry is
about
just a stand-in. I presume we could find other things we value if we thought about them a bit. And then the
sure.
question is, if the AIs save those things, is it okay if AIs replace humans if they inherit enough of the culture we cherish? Because, but of course, if you decide it's just as hard to prevent, to save free inquiry as it is to save humans doing most of the work or something, then you might think these are equally some of the problems. I'm suggesting, though, that preventing AIs from replacing humans is just a vastly larger, harder problem to accomplish than preventing AIs from saving free inquiry and
Yeah.
other key things we value.
Yeah. I guess my intuition is still though that the amount of control we'll have over like the distant future is just like sort of close to 0 or 1. And it really seems
I
like,
don't see how it ever gets close to one.
well,
How,
in the
what, I don't see any scenario where it's
no
close to one. It makes any
the one is
sense.
the like horrible global value
No, but
rewrite.
I don't see that working. That is, I see
Okay.
you creating it and I see it falling apart in a terrible, terrible crash and a mess. I don't see
Hmm.
it actually saving the values.
Okay.
I
I
see
guess,
it
but
failing.
sure. I guess I also don't like. I know that you talked about legacies, but I guess for the types of things like free inquiry, maybe that's like maybe this is a good acid test. Is like, you have these concrete legacies that we can encode, and then it's like, could any of those make it easier to preserve free inquiry or make increase the fraction of the future which has free inquiry or something like that?
I mean, my simplest default is just to save our current global monoculture, which includes free inquiry and many other things we cherish,
Ah,
and then
okay.
just to push that package forward. That's the simplest way to save many of the things we value because they're just in that package. We don't have to enumerate them and check them off on the moving list, right?
Hmm.
You just like it's like picking up a whole house and moving it rather than like packing everything into moving vans. If you can just move the whole house, well, then you don't have to track all the things inside the house and make sure they get there, right? So that's my simplest approach is just say, let's save our current shared monoculture and have it be adaptive enough so that when AI picks it up, it's an adaptive culture then, and then it can last.
I see. I will still note that I feel like these things again, like not to use free inquiry too much, but it does seem like it's not clear to me how to connect that to the things that you enumerated we could leave legacies for. And I guess I imagine future AI civilization being so sort of if it really gets its shit together at some point, it'll just go through and like do some self audit and be like, what are the things that we actually think are serving us? And um, I mean, again, maybe there will be some self-sustaining cultural bubbles, but also it could just be that at some point people or AIs get together and they're like, let's
But
just redesign our culture from scratch.
but in our world, many of the things that we have continue out of momentum of network effects, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That is, a lot of employers want smart students, and so they pick students who go to school, and school teaches free inquiry, and school teaches them many things that our culture passes on. It's not because the employers want those things, it's because we happen to be in an equilibrium where school is the best way to get it, and school happens to teach those things, right? But those are kinds of momentum and lock in effects that we should expect to continue in the world. If AIs in the future get educated and show off by having the same sort of education that humans have in the past. They'll want to show off the education that humans have used, and they will those that education teaches free inquiry and teaches many common values of our civilization.
Sure. I will say one thing that I think our culture rightly celebrates is when everyone gets together and notes a bad equilibrium and says like, it's today is like, change which side of the road we drive on day or
Right?
vaccinated day or whatever. And then we have a new, better equilibrium. And so I guess I'm imagining like more of those in the future. And so a lot of the stuff that unless like somehow it gets forced to be intrinsically valued, uh, like some future cultural cleanup will happen and then get rid of the stuff that's sort of accidental there.
I think maybe you don't take cultural evolution as seriously as I do, but maybe that would be for a different conversation. I think you are thinking that values are just held constant and that they don't evolve through cultural evolution, and I'm thinking no, that they are just as plastic as everything else.
Oh, I do, I do. I guess that's my fear, right? Is like, um,
But they're also just as entrenched as everything else and as plastics. That is, just like the location of our city is pretty entrenched, even though in principle we can move them all. And there are programming languages are entrenched, even though there's 1,000 possible alternative languages we could use. And we have a lot of entrenched systems. And I'm basically just saying, let's take our most entrenched shared world system and pre prevent it from collapsing and being destroyed because it embodies a bunch of the stuff we value.
okay. Hmm.
I mean, just like if you could have prevented the fall of the Roman Empire, then, a lot of Roman stuff would have lasted farther. If you were somebody who wanted the Roman gods to be worshipped, you wanted the Roman Empire to last
Hmm.
because that's what would have saved the gods.
Well, but okay, but I feel like we're just back to the paradox of tolerance, right? Because it's like, well, what if the Roman Empire hadn't collapsed, but Christianity had still like, numerically outcompeted the Roman gods? Then it's like, at what cost? So, like we saved Rome, but now we don't worship the Roman gods anymore, sort of thing.
Sure, but I mean, just all else equal, I think just many things in the Roman Empire went away because the Roman Empire fell. That is, I think that's just a safe way to understand history. Counterfactually, without the fall of the Roman Empire or falling sooner, cultural things in the Roman Empire would have lasted and spread it farther. I
Yeah.
mean, we already inherited many things from them because even though the Roman Empire did fall, the collapsed civilization still inherited many things from them,
Yeah,
but
maybe it's
just
one of these
less.
things where I underestimate how much culture I've inherited because it's like the water I swim in, and that to me, I just feel like the West has lived through this like cultural optimization drift period where just so much stuff has changed and been lost, and it's like been more competitive in a lot of respects, but not in the like keep culture alive, but in terms of like just like what spreads virally. And so I guess I just sort of feel like that might just sort of like wipe out a huge fraction of what we care about for no reason, which I guess is the sort of stuff you're worrying about in terms of cultural drift. Um, and I
Right, but
guess you're
I'm
saying,
more
well, let's
willing to
just,
think that the things I value have a substantial adaptive value, but different versions might have more or less adaptive value. And for each of the
mm,
things I value, I'm going to first say, how can I find the most adaptive version of it so that we could switch to that? Because that could protect it from being lost more rather
yeah,
than just assuming it's not adaptive and I need to find a totalitarian government to force it on people. I'd more say let's search in each thing that's valuable for the most value, like children's laughter. I might say, look, let's try to make sure we understand why children's laughs, why that has been useful, and try to make sure that whatever that function is persists so that it will persist.
yeah, yeah. And maybe I'm just like have less faith that I'll be able to justify a lot of the stuff I care about. And maybe also as you actually are sort of more conservative than I was, as I had before, a starting point that I thought of where you're saying, look, the other cultures are like so bad. Us just collapsing is something that we really need to worry about. And I guess I'm trying to say like, well, I kind of expect most of the competitive parts of our culture to sort of stick around or be reinvented eventually. And then the like human parts is like what I'm afraid of losing forever.
But most of the things I think you value about humans, AI could continue with. They can have children's laughter, they can have love, they can have jokes, they can have free inquiry. Ask
Yeah,
what about humans that you value can't AI inherit and preserve?
that's a fair question. I guess I also expect to be browbeaten into accepting. Like, let's imagine it's kind of like fake meat. It's like, there in principle could be the like ideal, perfect fake, the cultured meat that's actually as good as current meat. There could also be the like not quite as good version.
Right?
And I anticipate that when we have the not quite as good version, it's going to become illegal or like too costly to have the like old one. And I kind of expect the same thing to happen with humans. It's like, well,
Okay, but look, in that case, meat mostly it goes on, continues on, right? Not quite the same meat, but look, if you look at meat we eat today, it's not really the same as meat from a century or 2 centuries ago. Meat has changed over the centuries. It's
yes,
cheaper, more available, but it's different meat.
this is fair. Okay, the point is, I think I agree with you that there is like a better version of the future humans that is like machine augmented, and then I also expect to be browbeaten into accepting like an actually worse version that ends up sort of betraying us and not actually caring about a lot of the things we care about.
Well, I think we'll have to stop this now, but I'm happy to have another conversation if we continue this.
Cool. It was my pleasure, Robin. Thank you.
All right.